The topic of this video is enormous combat starships designed to intimidate any enemy of any size who dares to challenge first the Republican democracy and then the totalitarian authoritarian values of the New Order. Concocted by a known entity following the transformation of the Republic into the First Galactic Empire. First, a brief excursion into the history of the third planet from the Sun on which you are all currently seated. Just as Star Wars, like any other fictional world, is influenced by real history, including military history, the galaxy of Star Wars at times represents a sort of distorted mirror, projecting into cosmic expanses images from the real past. Enormous superships were no exception, as well as the concept of super battleships as extremely expensive and utterly useless vessels, fit only to entertain the reigning owner's sense of self-importance. Such ships have always been attempted to be created everywhere since the advent of ships as such. One only needs to recall the giant floating palaces of the Roman era discovered in Lake Nemi, or the semi-legendary giant warship Leontophorus, the appearance of which can only be fantasized about. But it boasted a declared crew of almost 3,000 personnel, of whom 1,600 were rowers. Or we can recall the very large catamaran galley Tessara Conteras, built in the Hellenistic period of Egypt in the 3rd century AD, by order of Ptolemy IV Philopator. This catamaran galley is quoted by Athenaeus in his Deipnosophistae. In the Middle Ages and the modern era, there were also attempts to build something to inspire one's allies and frighten enemies. Often these efforts to create such structures ended in failure, but proved to be a very expensive indulgence. In the modern era, such attempts were also made. For example, the famous Swedish pronunciation Vasa, named after the dynasty. Enormous for its time and insanely expensive even by contemporary standards, adorned with stucco, tiles, ruffles, statues, and other fineries made of precious metals. This entire shipbuilding creation was supposed to become the pride and symbol of the might of the Swedish fleet, the might of the dynasty. However, due to construction errors, the ship sank on its maiden voyage in August 1628. 333 years later, enterprising Viking descendants raised the sunken vessel and turned it into a museum. As you know, creating Star Wars George Lucas was inspired not by the Romans, Greeks, or monarchs from the Vasa dynasty, but by events of the Second World War. For example, you can recall the American Iowa-class battleships, Giants. They not only survived the Second World War, but remained in service for over 50 years. And the sad experience of using the very expensive super battleships of the past was reflected in reality in the image of superships in many fictional universes. Star Wars was no exception. As a rule, these are often very expensive, rarely used, and for the most part useless ships, although often does not mean always. Recall what made the Executor, Vader's flagship, notable in the movie? Essentially nothing. In Episode 5, it leisurely flew across the screen. And in the next episode, the Executor served as an imposing backdrop for the second Death Star. It fired a bit, then the famous Crinid destroyed the deck along with all its inhabitants. They didn't manage to take control from the auxiliary bridge, and as a result, the ship crashed into its own station. In the supplementary materials, primarily in the original Star Wars and in the expanded universe, these ships have a more interesting combat history. Yet, they still couldn't shake off the stigma of being the Emperor's expensive and useless toys, with rare exceptions. Let's start with Sovereign. At 15 kilometers long, such a ship can truly be the master of any cosmic battle, as it was, without exaggeration, the most powerful ship in the galaxy, not only of its time, but in the entire history of the galaxy. Well, not counting the Eclipse, of course, but we will get to it later. All Sovereign-class ships were painted black. Thus, the Sovereign-class Superstar Destroyer is another titan of Imperial military might. Ships of this class were a reduced version of the Superstar Destroyer Eclipse class, although they were intended to perform the same tasks on the battlefield. The construction of the first Sovereign began a year before the Battle of Endor at the Quat Corporation's shipyards located in orbit around Biss. After the first death of the Emperor, the construction process of these ships suffered the same issues as the construction of the Eclipse. Lack of funding, material shortages, and even a deficit in specialists led to delays. The ship carries less armament, fewer fighters, and has lower speeds in hyperspace and real space compared to the Eclipse. However, when it comes to armament, it's fully equipped. Just like on the Eclipse, a superlaser was installed, whose power was equivalent to 1/3 the power of the Death Star's superlaser. This means that a shot would not be enough to completely destroy a planet in one go, but it could turn any planetoid into an uninhabitable scorched desert. Alternatively, it could eventually penetrate a planet's core with multiple shots, triggering core destabilization. Tactical use of the superlaser was also possible by adjusting it to a lower power setting. In this tactical variant, the superlaser could easily destroy individual cities and large military bases on a planet's surface, even if the planet had a planetary shield, which the superlaser ignored completely. Even a very powerful planetary shield could be easily overloaded by the superlaser, making it possible to deploy ground forces. And there was a lot to deploy. On board, the Sovereign, up to 130,000 soldiers and officers of the Imperial Army, or Stormtrooper Corps, could be quartered along with armored vehicles, artillery, 5 rapid deployment bases, and other standard equipment. For deploying all of this, the ship had an ample number of cargo and landing shuttles, as well as landing AT-AT barges for delivering heavy equipment. The Sovereign alone could easily transport 75 of the colossal AT-AT walkers. In addition, the ship's enormous holds could accommodate up to 400,000 metric tons of cargo. The full crew numbered 86,000 officers and sailors. But let's return to the weaponry. In space combat, the superlaser was the main caliber of the super battleship, with which the Sovereign could disintegrate any large ship in the galaxy into atoms in an instant, except perhaps the Eclipse. Even the New Republic's super battleship Viscount would hardly survive more than one shot. This conclusion can be drawn from comparing their technical specifications. The Sovereign also had plenty of conventional weaponry. There were as many as 500 turbo-laser batteries. Typically, batteries refer to turrets. However, it is not specified how many guns they consisted of. They could be twin turrets with XX-9 heavy turbo-lasers, the standard weapon of Imperial Star Destroyers, especially its early versions, or 8-gun turrets of the same Superstar Destroyers, which became the most commonly seen main caliber on mid to late series ships. Besides these 500 batteries, there were also 500 heavy laser cannons, suitable for both firing at large ships and providing a defensive barrage against enemy torpedo bombers. This was complemented by 75 ion cannons and 100 tractor beam projectors. Missile launchers and torpedo tubes were somehow not installed on the Sovereign. In general, compared to some other super battleships, such as the Acerta or Bellator, the Sovereign carried relatively few conventional weapons, considering its colossal size. The entire point was in the superlaser. This mega-weapon took up almost 1/3 of the ship's internal space, from bow to nearly the stern. It was more than enough for dealing with any targets, making all other armaments auxiliary, including even very powerful ship turbo lasers. But that's not all. The incredibly successful use of interdictor vessels, which prevented enemies from escaping into hyperspace and allowed for more precise emergence of their own ships from hyperspace, led designers to think that there would definitely be room for them on such a giant. Also, the enormous reactor of the Sovereign would undoubtedly support the power needs of these energy-hungry devices, as on interdictor-class warships and corresponding modifications of Star Destroyers. Choices often had to be made, fending off small fighters and bombers, keeping shields at maximum, or activating gravity wells. Here, such a choice was not required. There was enough energy for everything. The Sovereign had as many as 5 gravity well projectors installed. During battles, this fact became a death sentence for many cruisers and battleships of the New Republic, and sometimes for entire squadrons. You cannot defeat it, nor can you escape. Even fleeing with standard engines beyond the effective range of the guns is futile, for the superlaser will reach you everywhere. Surrender is the only option. The reborn Lord of the Galaxy, furious with the New Republic, did not intend to take any captives, and the Sovereign's were ready to mercilessly tear the New Republic forces apart. The massive hangars of the Sovereign could accommodate up to 480 TIE fighters of various types, that is, 40 squadrons, and hundreds of the aforementioned light transports and shuttles. There would also be room for heavy fighters. such as the Alpha-class XG-1 Starwing. However, it is not specified whether the super battleships carried heavy fighters. Likely they were limited to only light fighters and short-range light bombers. However, the ship was exceedingly slow. Even its numerous, highly powerful engines of colossal size, in which several cruisers could fit, could not accelerate the Sovereign faster than 30 mglt. The ship also gained speed rather poorly. Pushing such a behemoth through hyperspace was also not easy. The hyperdrive they managed to fit was only a 3 class, and even then it must have been extraordinarily energy-consuming. Though the backup hyperdrive was not too shabby, an 8 class. In total, 4 ships of this class were built. The first was the Sovereign, after which the class was named. It was owned by Zinj. However, as soon as the dictator died over Dathomir in the year 8 ABY, the commander of the Sovereign fled to a secret fleet base on Bis, where the reborn emperor in a clone body had already begun assembling his army. It is appropriate to note that although the construction of the Sovereigns was clearly not a big secret, the Rebel Alliance was unaware of the existence of such a project until Endor. After Endor, the Rebel intelligence managed to obtain several very important documents, including a manual on the state of the Imperial Armed Forces prepared for senior officers. The document did not have the highest confidentiality mark, but was still classified as for official use only. Only then did the rebels, now the New Republic, begin to suspect something. However, the well-known rebel general Karlist Riken believed that the Empire had not achieved anything in the implementation of this project. He was convinced that none of the Sovereigns were at the disposal of the surviving Grand Moffs and Grand Admirals who led the remnants of the collapsing Empire. Riken had a reputation as a person capable of more or less accurately analyzing the enemy's capabilities and industrial potential. Moreover, he was a brilliant tactician and especially a strategist for the Rebel Alliance and the New Republic. The head ship of the Sovereign series, upon returning to Bis, immediately underwent re-equipping and rearming as it had been obtained by Zinj without its main weapon, the Super Laser. For this reason, Zinj's flagship was the Executor-class Superstar Destroyer, not the Sovereign. The second ship was the Autarch class. The third in the series was named the Despot class. However, the fourth ship in the series was not as fortunate with its name. It was called the Heresiarchs. By the time of the reborn emperor's return, the process of staffing the ships with personnel and equipment, along with the installation and tuning of weaponry, was ongoing. Super lasers were the priority. However, by the start of the emperor's military campaign against the New Republic, the Sovereigns had not yet been fully commissioned, and only the first lead ship in the series managed to participate in battles with the New Republic. The Sovereign, being the flagship of one of the squadrons, participated in several operations of the reborn emperor, indeed proving the viability of the super battleship's concept. Like the Eclipse, the Sovereigns was virtually invulnerable to all cruisers and battleships of the New Republic, and like its elder brother, remained undefeated in open battle. The Eclipse and the Sovereigns, two mighty black ships. When Bis was destroyed by the Galaxy Gun along with the eponymous planetary system, it is likely that the Sovereigns perished as well. But we have no exact data on this. Most likely, the ship did indeed perish over Bis. Otherwise, it is impossible to explain why it is absent in subsequent events. By the way, during the war with the Yuuzhanvong, Luke Skywalker greatly regretted that they had once destroyed the Galaxy Gun rather than capturing it. It would have been very useful for the New Republic in destroying the Fong world ships and the large living ships of the armada of uninvited guests. The fate of the other three, the Sovereigns, which were constructed but not fully completed, is unknown. They could have perished along with Bis or have been saved by their crews, who might have taken the unfinished ships to uncharted regions or into the fleets of other Imperial remnants. The 5-year autonomy level permits this. The official franchise holders, and primarily George Lucas himself, chose to leave this question unanswered. On the other three, the Sovereigns, let me remind you, the super laser was not yet installed. At the time of Palpatine's final death, these ships had not been fully commissioned. However, there is more information about the elder brother of the Sovereigns, the Eclipse-class dreadnought. After all, the Eclipse class has more renown within the fan community, which is self-evident. It is the most powerful ship in the entire Star Wars franchise. Fans love such things very much. Also, it is the largest by volume but not by length. Vong-world ships don't count, as they were formerly not combat ships, but rather enormous living station megalopolises. And the Mega-class Star Dreadnought from the new canon, which was destroyed in the 8th episode, also cannot be considered a combat ship. Essentially, it is also a world ship. Now about the Eclipse class. A total of 2 of these supergiants were built, the Eclipse 1 and the Eclipse 2. Perhaps only the great power is aware of how many more supership projects still wander in the minds of Imperial engineers. The project for the new supership was conceived long before its keel was laid on the slips at Kuat, even before Palpatine's order, and at the stage of creating test stands for the super laser being constructed for the Death Star. Incidentally, the hull of one of the unfinished Eclipse-class ships also served as a test stand for the super laser of the Death Star. In the end, it was converted into the Tarkin station. The Kuat shipyards began simultaneously constructing 2 super battleships of this class. They were laid down on the slips at Kuat shortly after the destruction of the first Death Star. Although one article in the 89th issue of Star Wars Insider magazine states that the Eclipses began to be constructed at the very beginning of the Galactic Civil War. This war, let me remind you, began in 2 BBY, which means there is some discrepancy in the sources, and there is another confusion with the shipyards. The fact is that the Kuat Drive Yards Corporation owned not only the enormous shipyards encircling the planet Kuat. The corporation possessed dozens of shipyards in various parts of the galaxy. There were also enormous shipyards in orbit around the secret Imperial fortress planet Biss. Therefore, there is reason to suggest that the Eclipse 2 was not being constructed in orbit around Kuat, but at the shipyards near Biss. There was enough space on the slips there for it. However, the Eclipse 1 was certainly being constructed over Kuat. Perhaps the differences in construction of the Eclipse 1 and the Eclipse 2 are related to the final assembly locations. The Eclipse 2 had a different engine placement and also a turret-like structure at the bow. In any case, the ships were built with all measures of secrecy. Even the intelligence of the Rebel Alliance, which usually sees and hears a lot, with all its agent intelligence and traitors in Imperial ranks, learned nothing about the Eclipse until 4 ABY, when the ship was already 70% complete. But even when they found out, General Karlist Riken was firmly convinced that the Imperials would not complete the Eclipse either. He and the entire Rebel and later New Republic intelligence were confident that the Empire was building only one Eclipse-class ship, not suspecting that another was being built somewhere else. The rebels found out about the Eclipse shortly after the victory over Endor when, taking advantage of the chaos and uncertainty in the Imperial ranks, they planned a raid on the Kuat shipyards to slightly reduce the production capacity of the main Imperial shipyards. There also aimed with his large and motley fleet, the crime lord Tiber Zahn. Tiber himself learned about the Eclipse project shortly after 4 ABY, but only through rumors. For several years he couldn't find out where exactly this ship was being constructed and what it was like. And when he did, he desired to capture the unfinished The Eclipse and all the design documentation for the ship. And Tiber Zahn loved big deadly ships. Just take a look at his flagship battleship, also equipped with a very powerful weapon. The rebels, who had not yet declared their formation into a new republic, were also interested in the Eclipse, keen on its destruction, fully aware of the trump card it could become in the deck of any Imperial remnant. Although the objectives of the rebels and bandits were different, and they often fought against each other, they decided to temporarily combine their forces for this attack. The rebels assembled a very large fleet for the assault on Kuat, but the defense of Kuat had also been built over many years, and there were always many warships there. The sector fleet of Kuat, I must remind you, was one of the largest in the Empire. Near the sector's capital planet, a grandiose space battle soon erupted. Taking advantage of the moment, elite fighters of the Zahn Consortium, along with a trained crew and engineers, boarded the unfinished The Eclipse. There was almost no security on the construction ship, and it was not difficult for them to take control of the captain's bridge, the superlaser control post, the communications bay, and the engine room. The full crew of the Eclipse numbers in the hundreds of thousands, but to get it moving and start firing, a few hundred trained specialists were enough. The rebels, of course, were against the capture of the Tiber Zan super battleship. They demanded the destruction of the ship, but it was already too late. At this moment, Zan turned the weapon against their recent allies. By Tiber Zan's order, the Eclipse began firing the super laser, taking down heavy cruisers, star destroyers, and frigates. But the dreadnought was still not finished. The super laser fell silent after a few shots. Nonetheless, towards the end of the battle, they managed to get it working again and fired a few more volleys. During the battle, Tiber Zan's fleet and the successfully captured the Eclipse at the beginning of the engagement destroyed the Rebel Alliance fleet that had arrived, except for the Millennium Falcon and a couple of other rebel ships that were lucky enough to escape. They also annihilated many ships of the Imperial Defensive Fleet, even the Superstar Destroyer, the Annihilator, the flagship of Admiral Garn, which had come to the shipyard's aid after receiving the distress signal, was hit. This was one of those rare occasions when an Executor-class Superstar Destroyer perished in battle. However, in such a massive skirmish, even a super battleship struggled to survive. Zan could not leverage the trophy. The Eclipse was too large and too complex for his forces. He lacked the specialists to operate the ship. Moreover, maintaining a super battleship was a costly and complicated affair even for very large states like the New Republic or the Galactic Empire. The ship was still unfinished, and Zan had nowhere to complete it. Zan simply abandoned the Eclipse, used it briefly, and deserted it. The drifting vessel was soon found by the Rebel Alliance fleet, but the rebels had the same problems as Tiber Zan. They attempted to destroy the unfinished Eclipse, but failed. Even an immobile super battleship without a crew was too thick-skinned a beast to be taken down just like that. The rebels never managed to decide what to do with it or how to destroy it. The Eclipse was returned to the shipyards and began to be repaired and completed. After the Endor disaster and the beginning of the disintegration of the Empire into small state entities, the construction of the ship experienced severe interruptions and sometimes even stopped altogether. It simply was not a priority. Serious efforts to complete it began only 4.5 years after Endor, when a group of engineers from Quat fled to Biss on the unfinished The Eclipse, escaping the occupation of Quat by New Republic forces. Thanks to the help of the fleeing engineers, the construction of both the Eclipses was completed within a year, that is, in 10 ABY. Both constructed ships took a vigil over the planet Biss, where the clones of the reborn Emperor were being grown. Overall, the completion and commissioning of the Dreadnought took over 6 years. Thus, in the context of the Star Wars universe, the ship can be considered a long-term project. Let me remind you that the assembly of the Executor-class super battleship took the Empire a little over 1.5 years. Before the Emperor's campaign against the New Republic began, both the Eclipses were in orbit serving as space stations. Given their size and shape, they could indeed be mistaken for very large planetary defense orbital stations. Primarily, the Eclipse housed senior officers and convened the military council. It was there that the Emperor and his admirals developed the plan to attack the New Republic. When his war against the New Republic began, it was the Eclipse that Palpatine chose as his flagship, further increasing the already terrifying status of the Dreadnought. While on the orbit of Biss, both the Eclipses were fully completed, equipped with necessary equipment, crews were formed, and most importantly, all weapon systems, including the main caliber, the super laser, were installed and calibrated. The ship's length was 17,500 meters, a whole city with a vast population. The full crew of the Eclipse was 708,470 officers and sailors, alongside the 150,000 troops. But the question arises, how did a couple of hundred Tiber Zan's bandits manage to somehow operate the Eclipse, while the Imperials needed 700,000 people? It should be noted that even very large ships in Star Wars can be set into motion by very small crews. Even an Imperial-class Star Destroyer can be made to move and fire somehow with a crew of 20 people. But for the full operation and management of the Eclipse, a crew of 88,500 was needed, and 708,470 is the total crew complement. This included personnel of all specialties, including those not needed in battle. It is most likely that during combat missions the ship did not have 700,000 people on board. They simply were not needed. Moreover, the Emperor was experiencing a personnel shortage. Returning to the 150,000 people on board, Naturally, the soldiers traveled in the company of a proportional amount of military equipment, ranging from troop transport trucks and passenger speeders to heavy tanks, walkers, and artillery pieces. 150,000 soldiers in the context of Star Wars, this is often enough to take control of an entire planet by capturing its key strategic locations, or sometimes even several planets simultaneously. In addition to this, the Eclipse stationed a distinct assault battalion from Kampfforce and an entire legion of Imperial Guard, including elite guardsmen. However, these were no longer quite the same guardsmen who protected the Emperor before Endor. The new Guard Corps was formed only a few years before the Emperor's resurrection, partially from the old personnel, and partially by recruiting new ones. To disembark this multitude of forces, several hundred transport ships traveled within the vast hangars of the vessel, from small Guardian-class light cruisers and Lambda-class shuttles to massive AT-AT barge. Moreover, the hangars housed as many as 700 TI fighters of various models, 58 squadrons, as well as a number of unnamed class fighter bombers. However, according to other reports, the ship's air group composition was as follows: 444 TIE fighters, 37 squadrons, 72 I-7 Howl Runner starfighters, 6 squadrons, 72 A-9 Vigilance interceptors, 36 Alpha-class XG-1 Starwings and XM-1 missile boats, configured into 3 squadrons, and also 400 light transports and landing barges of all modifications. Its main armament was an axial superlaser, technology similar to that used on the Death Star. Although not as powerful, it still had 2/3 of its potency, which is still immense. The superlaser is located along the ship's axis and forms a single entity with the keel, the principal structural element of the hull. The main caliber of the Eclipse was the most powerful weapon ever installed on a spacecraft in the history of the galaxy. It could destroy a planet or turn its surface into a lifeless desert. In space combat, the superlaser could effortlessly disintegrate any contemporary and well-armored battleship of the New Republic into dust. And not only of the New Republic, but any battleship in the galaxy. With the superlaser, the Eclipse could in mere seconds obliterate the flagship of any fleet of former rebels that stood in its way. It's not hard to imagine what would inevitably follow. Loss of control over the fleet, chaos, panic. Another potential target for the superlaser, of course, were planets. The capabilities of the superlaser allowed it to make relatively precise strikes on the surface, demolishing only cities and fortified areas without destroying the planet and its atmosphere. Even planetary shields could not save from the superlaser. They either became overloaded and shut down, or were simply pierced through as if they did not exist. The ship's additional armament included traditional laser, ion, and turbolaser cannons, the quantity and power of which allowed the Eclipse to single-handedly withstand an entire fleet, even without the superlaser. 500 towers of heavy turbolasers, 550 towers with heavy laser cannons, 75 ion cannons, 100 tractor beam projectors. And again, as with the Sovereign class, not a single torpedo launcher or light cannon for countering enemy bombers. Although the Eclipse did not need them, considering the multitude of onboard fighter squadrons numbering in the hundreds and the mandatory escort corvettes and frigates. This, combined with its powerful armor and shields, made the Eclipse nearly invulnerable in space combat. Even thousands of bombers could not cause significant damage to this behemoth. Contributing to the guaranteed conversion of any enemy squadron into space debris were 10 gravity well projectors. Their number and capture area did not allow even a large fleet to escape. Disabling the gravity wells was no easy task, as they were securely hidden beneath the armor. This can be considered a correction of previous errors, as the absence of gravity wells on the Executor class, Bellator class, and other superships often allowed the rebel fleet to escape without engaging the super battleship in open combat. The battle over Endor could have been different if the Executor or even the Death Star itself had featured gravity wells. The magnificent sensors of the Eclipse possessed an unprecedentedly large scan and target acquisition range. This fact, combined with the aforementioned superlaser, gave the supership outstanding combat capabilities. No matter the distance at which an enemy appeared, the Eclipse always retained the right to strike first. At the ship commander's discretion, it was apparently possible to enforce a radio silence mode across an entire sector or holonet silence. During the campaign aimed at reclaiming territories liberated or occupied by the New Republic, the reborn Emperor successfully utilized the new super-dreadnoughts. Entire fleets and defensive structures of the New Republic worlds close to the core regions and inner ring proved powerless against the new superships and their super lasers. They had no choice but to flee. Nara Dunn, an officer of the New Republic fleet, described her first and thankfully last encounter with the Eclipse as follows. When the hyperspace tunnel opened, this black giant appeared among the stars. At first we thought it was a ghost ship, some anomaly on the sensors, until it opened fire. The New Republic suffered severe losses in both personnel and ships, retreating on all fronts with no chance of victory against the technologically superior enemy. In a short time, the reborn Emperor reclaimed significant territories previously captured by the New Republic in recent years. Incidentally, an astonishing fact. The New Republic government, although aware of the significant losses among its squadrons and allied fleets, and knowing that the opponent had a well-equipped modern fleet, took no effective active measures to counteract the threat. The intelligence of the New Republic proved blind and deaf, knowing only what any Republican refugee escaping from the Central Worlds knew. It soon became apparent that the above-mentioned attacks by the resurrected Emperor were merely the first phase. His military campaign, after rehearsal, was followed by the main strike, which he, unfortunately for the Imperials and fortunately for the New Republic, could not bring to a victorious end. Both the Eclipse ships the New Republic never managed to defeat in open combat, although it clearly tried. The Eclipse I was destroyed by the energy of the Force, skillfully utilized and redirected by Luke Skywalker, while the Eclipse II perished as a result of a successful sabotage by the Republicans in the BIS system. The superliner then collided with another massive ship, a galactic cannon, and perished along with it. The Eclipses entered history as the most powerful combat ships the galaxy had ever seen. Nothing comparable to them was created either then or even 100 years later. In the fleets of the Galactic Empire of the Fel Dynasty and the opposing Galactic Alliance, there was nothing like them. Of course, they had powerful, massive combat ships as well, but they built nothing that could compare in firepower not only with the Eclipses, but also with the Sovereigns. Listening to the story about the mighty, the Sovereigns, and the Eclipses, especially considering the Annihilator Imperial Executor-class Star Dreadnought destroyed in battle over Quat, you might have the impression that the Executors were something huge, but not serious or even completely useless. But this is not the case at all. But that is far from the case. The superliners, the Executor-class Star Dreadnought, were among the most powerful combat ships of the era, surpassing even the Assertors and Bellators. It seems appropriate to conclude our very long story today with the Executors, dagger-like ships instilling confidence in the allies of the Galactic Empire in its inviolability, while causing fear and panic in its enemies. The Executors were the longest-known combat ships in the history of the Star Wars universe. Yes, the very longest and combat-ready, as there are a couple of non-military ships in Star Wars that were larger than the Executor. The length of our hero is 19 kilometers. But this flying dagger has not always been of such length in official sources. The question of the length of the Executor has been a subject of debate for many years, both on internet forums and among George Lucas's team. The latter, for reasons known only to them, has a habit of periodically extending the ship and increasing its armament. The first such act of extension occurred in the mid-90s, when the Executor grew from 8 kilometers to as much as 12 kilometers and 800 meters. This length was established in one of the most respected sources of the late 90s, the electronic encyclopedia Star Wars Behind the Magic, released in 1998, ahead of the release of the first episode. The length of 8 kilometers had by then appeared in several handbooks, and was noted in the book series 10 Wing by Michael A. Stackpole. It was this 8-kilometer length that the American writer described Lusankya as having when the ship rose from the surface of Coruscant. I must note that, in my opinion, 8 kilometers seems somewhat insufficient for such a ship. It's even unclear why this figure was conceived. Now, concerning the figure of 12 kilometers 800 meters, it emerged as a result of frame-by-frame analysis of the fifth episode of the saga and the calculation of the length of the Executor relative to the Imperial I-class star destroyers flying next to it. Then, possibly to give the ship an even more intimidating appearance due to its gigantic size, the ship was lengthened once again. Now, the length was set at 19 kilometers. However, this figure was not chosen arbitrarily. It was also a result of calculations, but this time based on the sixth episode of the original trilogy. This figure was established in several handbooks, particularly in the Notes to Starship Battles, and in the Starships of the Galaxy edition of the ancient year 2007. Fortunately, only the length of the ship was altered. The remaining characteristics stayed the same, with the exception of the armament composition. When the ship was elongated, 500 light laser cannons were added to it. The main caliber of the Superstar Destroyer consisted of 258-gun turbo-laser towers. In total, 2,000 turbo-lasers and 2,000 cannons. The same amount and the same type of towers had just turbo-lasers. There were also 250 heavy ion cannons and 250 missile torpedo launchers, from which both heavy anti-ship missiles and torpedoes, as well as light missiles for countering fighters and bombers, could be launched. Although for combating bombers, the ship had as many as 500 light laser cannons. In total, the Executor had as many as 5,000 cannons, so no one could find it lacking. Complementing all this cannon missile variety were 40 tractor beam projectors. Tractor beams could and should be used not only for capturing enemy vessels and dragging them into the hangar for subsequent boarding, but also for hindering the maneuverability of light ships and vessels. But still, a few gravity wells should have been installed on the Executor. Though the modified tractor beams could be utilized in the new cannon of the Starhawk-class battleship in the Battle of Jakku, but the Executor had more than just cannons. To counter enemy bombers and fighters, the ship housed a numerous air group consisting of 12 squadrons, 144 small aircraft. Of these, there were typically about 10 fighter squadrons and 2 bomber squadrons. If necessary, the number of fighters could be increased almost twofold. The Dreadnought's air group also included 200 shuttles, transports, and landing craft. They were situated in 3 large hangars in the lower part of the Super Dreadnought. The guns were guided by a magnificent array of sensors and scanners dotted along the entire hull. Although the main block of sensors and communication antennas was located on the superstructure, the rest of the hull contained auxiliary ones. This sensor placement principle was inherited from the Imperial-class Star Destroyer. In terms of sensor range, the Executor surpassed almost all ships in the Galactic Empire's fleet. This combined with numerous probe droids allowed Imperial squadrons led by such flagships to easily locate even well-hidden bases of the Rebel Alliance and other enemies of the Empire. It was primarily the elite fleet formation Death Squadron, formerly commanded by Vader, that was tasked with searching and destroying Rebel bases. Recall the detection of Echo Base in Episode 5. Destroying the main sensor domes and communication antennas without disabling the shield could only be achieved by diving under the shield. That meant flying within a few meters of the ship's hull. This was far from easy and not always successful. In a similar manner, one could destroy the Executor's shields. Dive under the deflector field, destroy the shield projectors. Difficult but possible, provided the pilot was a professional, and if the ship had not simultaneously activated its particle shield which protected the Executor from physical objects. Incidentally, during the Battle of Yavin, the particle shield saved the recently commissioned Executor from certain death. During the pursuit of the Alliance fleet, after the Battle of Yavin, the fan favorite ordered Admiral Amice Griff to track down and destroy the rebel squadron. Following this order, his life became short and unhappy. No, he didn't flee. He literally evaporated. The Executor emerged from hyperspace and rushed in pursuit of the rebels, ending up at the location where 3 Imperial-class Star Destroyers from Griff's squadron were supposed to arrive, and they did appear. On exit from hyperspace, they collided with Vader's flagship. The ship struck the Executor at tremendous velocity and shattered against its energy shield, shattered completely. The rebels managed to escape. An unfortunate coincidence, Vader's impatience, and Griff's precise exit from hyperspace led to the simultaneous destruction of 3 battleships at once. Of course, energy shields were not always activated, otherwise their own fighters wouldn't take off, and firing from under the shield would be rather difficult, but usually, deflectors were sufficient. As long as the shield was active, harming the Executor was incredibly difficult. And even if it was possible to weaken the shield in one of the segments of the massive ship, the armor had to be hit next, while simultaneously destroying the shield projectors. Otherwise, the reactor could restore the functionality of the damaged segment. The armored hull of the Executor was made of traditional titanium, reinforced with hostile armor plates. In some sections of the hull, the armor was made of plastoid. Lyra knew what she was doing. The speech, of course, concerns the legendary Lyra Wessex, daughter of the equally renowned shipbuilder Wallace Blissex, also an enthusiast of large vessels. Wallace's most famous creation was the Victory-class Star Destroyer. Additionally, thanks to him, the Delta-7 Aethersprite-class light interceptors, the Eta-2 Actes-class light interceptor, the Alpha-3 Nimbus-class 5-wing starfighter came into existence, and he also participated in the development of the best interceptor for the Alliance and the New Republic, the RZ-1 A-wing. His daughter always wanted to surpass her father, and characteristically, she succeeded, and not just once. Under her leadership, the most successful mass-produced Imperial battleship, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, was created. Lyra saw the effect the introduction of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer had on all the fleet commanders in the galaxy, and how it raised the military prestige of her beloved empire. Therefore, shortly after the end of the Clone Wars, she conceived the idea of creating a super battleship for the Empire. Fortunately, she had good incentives and examples, namely the aforementioned magnificent super battleships from Quat, those created by the Bellators and the Assertors, already present in the assortment of the Mandators. The Emperor favored Lyra Wessex, although a number of military and senators clearly disliked her. Lyra Wessex was allocated funds, specialists, materials, and laboratories with scientific research and experimental construction docks. All of this was named Project Starhawk. The experimental ship was 12 kilometers long. Moreover, it was not as elongated as the final product. The ship was being built in orbit around Biss, but it was never completed, as insurgents from the Alderaanian resistance intervened. This was a rebel group led by Bail Organa, naturally led in secret, for at that time Bail was still an Imperial senator. The Imperial state security agencies tried to destroy them, but they never achieved significant success. On Alderaan, they trained, armed themselves, obtained equipment, conducted propaganda activities, and simply rested. When the Rebel Alliance appeared, the insurgents of the Alderaanian resistance were among its first fighters. Alderaan was a thorn in the side for the Grand Moff. In the 17th BBY, members of the Alderaanian resistance carried out a sudden, daring raid on the experimental dockyard. Brave rebel pilots flew through the unfinished innards of the super battleship and blew up its reactor. At that time, it was the largest ship of the Galactic Empire, although it was unfinished and defenseless by itself. Although it was merely an experimental platform designed to test technologies and engineering solutions for the construction of future superships. But the fact of the destruction of such a giant became a powerful informational pretext, which was immediately used by propagandists of all rebel movements in the galaxy. This led to an influx of new fighters against the regime into the ranks of the disparate rebel groups at that time. Since Lyra was not to blame for this failure, the Emperor allowed the continuation of Project Starhawk. Although it would not be accurate to call it a failure, as during the construction of the experimental ship, Lyra and her team of engineers gained valuable experience, refined the design, and conducted numerous experiments on a prototype model. The new ship was now 19 kilometers long, as Lyra wished and as the Lord Palpatine himself desired. He always found vast ships insufficient. He wanted everything all at once. Projects for super dreadnoughts always had opponents in the Imperial General Staff, and not all of the Emperor's advisors agreed with their lord's gigantomania. There was mild opposition in all circles of power, including among the military. Some spoke about the complexity of the project, others about its prohibitive expense. However, in the end, the series-built The Executor did not turn out to be that expensive. 1,143,350,000,000 credits per unit, or the price of 8 Star Destroyers. But Lyra did not care about the critics. She worked diligently. Fortunately, she also had influential allies, including her husband, Grand Moff, who helped promote the project, secure necessary funding, and allocate resources. Speaking of influential defenders of Project Starhawk, among them was the renowned Admiral Conan Antonio Motti, who perished on the Death Star over Yavin. He was a fervent supporter of super dreadnoughts. Motti believed that the Empire should have at least 20 ships of this class, one per sector as a flagship in each of the 20 Imperial sectors, essentially military districts. But Motti turned out to be optimistic. The Empire never received 20 super dreadnoughts due to the Endor disaster, in which, as you recall, Palpatine outsmarted himself. Several ships of this new class were laid down at the Fondor shipyards. They were built under the strictest secrecy. At that time, under the Emperor's and Lyra's orders, the entire Fondor system was closed to civilian navigation. Only specially certified transports and Imperial military ships were allowed to enter the system. Even then, not all ships were allowed, and any others were fired upon without warning. The Fondor shipyards dedicated themselves entirely to the interests of the Imperial fleet. Civilian contract ships were quickly taken over by Fondor's subsidiary shipyards and other shipyards. Soon, the residents of Fondor learned that their hated rivals from the Kuat Driveyards Corporation also received a similar contract and began constructing an identical The Executor at one of their subsidiary shipyards. Both ships initially bore the same name in the documents, The Executor, so that if anyone got wind of it, they would think there was only one ship, just an extra precaution. The Executor built at Kuat was later delivered to Coruscant, where it was carefully lowered to the planet's surface. It was named Lusankya. The inhabitants of a distant galaxy, even those dwelling in the Imperial capital, Coruscant, were unaware for a long time that right beneath their feet stood a massive, fully armed and manned behemoth spanning 19 kilometers, over which an entire city district had been built. Additionally, they managed to convince the populace that it was part of a planetary shield projector. They wouldn't have known if the New Republic hadn't attempted to liberate, or from the Imperial perspective, occupy the galactic capital a few years after the Battle of Endor. When the ship took off, the entire district vanished. It is not explicitly mentioned why the Emperor decided to bury the super battleship at the heart of the capital. Presumably he intended to use it as an emergency command post or as a means of escape if the capital were to find itself under an unbreachable blockade. Ultimately, it was indeed utilized, but not by the Emperor, who by then was presumed dead, but by the head of Ubictorate, the Imperial intelligence, who managed to flee the capital in time. However, if not for the Rebel Alliance, there wouldn't be much to tell, as the Empire might have limited itself to only 2 ships of this class. The projects continued, and Palpatine's attention was increasingly consumed by the Death Star project, which demanded an incredible amount of money and resources. The super dreadnoughts were pushed to the background, with construction proceeding slowly and with interruptions. But then, everything changed. It changed when the Executor and Lusankya were nearly completed, and a resident of Tatooine blew up the Death Star. The Emperor was furious. It was then that the Emperor and his cohorts once again turned their foggy gazes toward the super dreadnoughts. By that time, several more ships of the Executor class had been laid down, and their completion was ordered to be expedited, which was carried out. At the same time, crews began to be formed. Speaking of them, the full crew of a dreadnought numbered 280,734 personnel. But I repeat, it was not at all necessary for this entire number to be on board. For full functionality, a crew of 50,000 was sufficient. This is still a large number, but not nearly 300,000. Traditionally, there was also room on board the Executor for troops. The ship was equipped with cabins and barracks to comfortably accommodate 38,000 soldiers and space for several hundred units of various armored vehicles. There were firing ranges, crew training compartments, a spacious hospital, and other necessary facilities. This allowed the Executors to also be used as troop carriers and mobile headquarters for army groups. It should be noted that 38,000 stormtroopers were more than enough to take control of a planet with a population of several million people. And to control occupied territories, the enormous holds of a superstar destroyer contained assembly kits for 2 to 3 ground bases for rapid deployment. These prefab structures were usually deployed on planets where there was a threat of rebellion or the need to establish a temporary military base. However, the number of troops carried could vary significantly, as did the contents of all ships in the series. Unlike the Imperial Star Destroyers, The executors were not identical twins. Each was unique in its own way. For example, the already mentioned Lusankya had more advanced electronics, more crew quarters, and additional space first for prisoners and later for troops, sacrificing part of its artillery for this. The Imperial I-class star destroyer, the Intimidator, had an additional shield projector tower and was generally better protected. The hull of the ship, the Night Hammer, formerly known as the Night Hammer, was coated with a special polymer that helped conceal the massive dreadnought from enemy sensors. The ship, the Terror, was even equipped with a unique cloaking device that made the ship completely invisible. An invisible, enormous super battleship. What more could anyone dream of? Nonetheless, the dream remained just that, a dream. The rebels blew up the dreadnought through sabotage. Although the Executor possessed astonishing firepower and unprecedented capabilities, the Empire built them slowly as it did not need a large number of ships of this class. By the time of the Battle of Hoth, only 4 super battleships were in service, not counting the Lusankya, of course. Several other ships were in varying stages of construction at the Fondor shipyards and Quat. The proof of their battle capability was the destruction of the Rebel Alliance base on the planet Lactine. The first constructed, the Executor, became the personal ship of Darth Vader and was appointed the flagship of the Mobile Strike Fleet Death Squadron, whose task was to search for and destroy the bases and fleets of the Rebel Alliance, such as on the planet Lactine. Shortly after its construction, the Executor was actively engaged in many operations against the rebels and external enemies of the Empire. The most notable battles involving it included the destruction of a major Alliance base, as well as a small squadron along with a pirate republic in an asteroid field of the Vergesso. Another large-scale engagement involving the Executor was the battle in the Poln system, which resulted in the destruction of one of Nuso-Esfa's conquering fleets, consisting of 28 heavy cruisers, 100 escort ships, and 50 missile ships. This vast force was routed with minimal losses on the Imperial side, despite the numerical superiority of the enemy. By the time of the Battle of Endor, most of the ships in the ordered series of 12 had been built. Of these, 2, the aforementioned the Terror and the yet unmentioned the Vengeance, were lost. The Vengeance perished in the Battle of Nocto, which took place in the Aram sector 6 months before the Battle of Endor. Like many super battleships, it did not die in open combat nor in a firefight with enemy battleships and cruisers. No, such a ship cannot be simply destroyed. The rebels understood this perfectly, knowing they had nothing to counter the colossal resilience and firepower of the Dreadnought. They destroyed the ship using 3 Dauntless-class heavy cruisers and a Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser loaded with ultra-powerful explosives. Essentially, the cruisers turned into enormous 600-meter torpedoes. The 4th vessel was a CR-90 Corellian corvette named Thunder. It too was laden with proton bombs and rammed into the superstructure of the Executor in the attack. The giant was finished off by a squadron of B-wing starfighters. However, the rebel shipyards in the sector were completely destroyed, the local allies slaughtered, and the fleet suffered devastating losses, which could not be replenished. As a result, in the Aram sector, both sides lost. After the Battle of Endor, the Executors fell into the hands of some Imperial warlords, who immediately used them as a powerful argument to prove the legitimacy of their claims to various territories. And there is nothing surprising about that. One of the lucky owners of a super battleship was Zinj, who with the help of a super dreadnought managed to seize vast territories, including even the corporate sector. Zinj owned a ship with the beautiful name Iron Fist. However, it should be noted that his favorite flagship initially bore a different name. Having been launched as the 4th of its kind, the ship was given the name Brawl. Zinj renamed the ship as soon as he was entrusted with its command. He named it after the Victory-class star destroyer he previously commanded. The command did not object. Iron Fist, entering service a year after the destruction of the first Death Star, lived only 7 years. It was destroyed in the Battle of Dathomir in the 8th year after the Battle of Yavin. In the Battle of Korsin, in the expansion region, Grid Square M7, Zinj's fleet, led by the Iron Fist, inflicted significant losses on the 3rd Fleet of the New Republic. The destruction or capture of the Iron Fist and the Sovereign-class Superstar Destroyer, which, as I remind you, was also owned by Zinj, was second in importance only to the elimination of the dictator himself. The guns of Xinji's super battleship harmed not only the New Republic but also other Imperial remnants. For instance, during the raid on Quat in 7 ABY with the direct involvement of the Iron Fist, another Imperial remnant lost a bunch of TIE fighters and 2 Imperial-class Star Destroyers. These ships were named the Gilded Claw and Mauler. Furthermore, the Iron Fist was involved in the battles of Levian II, of Vahaba, of Salagas, and many others. However, Xinj lost in the latter 2 battles. Throughout all these skirmishes, the dictator never gave up hope of acquiring another dreadnought. But fate had other plans for him. Nonetheless, he briefly managed to hijack another super dreadnought, the Executor class, bearing an even stranger name, Razor's Kiss. The ship was stolen with the minimal possible crew. But before the dictator could start celebrating, New Republic operatives sabotaged the dreadnought, and then it was attacked by a task force led by the Mon Calamari MC-80B heavy cruiser. Not wanting the precious super battleship to fall into the hands of the New Republic, Xinji gave the order for the ship to self-destruct, which it obediently did, blowing up and breaking into pieces. The New Republicans considered the task completed and left. Xinj decided to make something out of the wreckage of the Razor's Kiss. Thus was born the Second Death, something extremely hideous, only 3 kilometers long. But at least they managed to attach a holographic camouflage system and cunning projectors on it. The resulting Frankenstein was hard to call a warship, because essentially it was a flying model, intended, if necessary, to conceal the loss of the flagship by sacrificing this flying dummy. The one who took the greatest pride in possessing a super battleship was truly worthy Imperial military and political figure, Grand Moff Ardus Kane, ruler of the largest remnant of his time called the Pentastar Alignment. His favorite flagship bore the name the Reaper, a worthy ship for a worthy man. As soon as Grand Moff Tarkin, thanks to the famous future Jedi's aim, turned into space dust over Yavin, Palpatine tasked Ardus Kane with leading the elite squadron Scourge Squadron and hunting down and destroying rebel bases and fleets in his area of responsibility, which Grand Moff executed successfully. The Scourge Squadron was a typical Imperial strike fleet, a large mobile unit consisting of selected ships and the best crews. There were very few such forces in the Empire. We mainly know the exploits of Death Squadron, the elite squadron commanded by Vader. Unfortunately, there are no details about Scourge Squadron, except that we know it existed. When Palpatine returned from beyond on Galactica-type Battlestar 1, he summoned his loyal defender and fighter for all things Imperial, Ardus Kane. He called him together with his super ship. Soon began the grandiose military campaign of the Emperor against the New Republic. So grandiose that the highest military and political leadership of the New Republic sometimes felt it was the end. And if not for Luke Skywalker and other famous characters, the New Republic might have disappeared. And if not for Luke, the New Republic might not have appeared at all. Speaking of it, the New Republic. The brave warriors of the killer democracy, fearless and blameless, not only destroyed the Executor-class super battleships, but also appropriated them. The first of such ships was the Lusankya. It was captured during the Battle of Thyfera at the end of the Bacta War, which began and ended 7.5 years ABY, after the destruction of the first, the Death Star. Not much was changed on the much-desired trophy. By the way, Lusankya was the only super battleship of the New Republic to engage in open combat with another such super battleship. This was the already mentioned the Reaper of Ardus Kane. Notably, the Reaper emerged victorious from the artillery duel. The crew of the Imperial ship had more combat experience. But unfortunately, the competent man Ardus Kane was already dead, having given his life for the Emperor in 10 ABY. The title of Grand Moff was taken by Gilad Pellaeon, a figure more well known to the fan community. It was Gilad who actually brought the Reaper into that battle. Gilad was a decent career politician, skilled in intrigues, and generally demonstrated himself as a competent organizer. Towards the end of the war, he even played the role of a peacemaker. However, he was a poor fleet commander. Nearly every space battle where he was not just a participant but the main actor, Gilad Pellaeon lost. He often lost with significant military and political repercussions for the Imperial remnant. And he lost even when he had numerical superiority on his side. The super battleship, the Reaper, also did not survive the lackluster leadership of Gilad Pelayon. The admiral lost the ship in the battle at Selenon. For those interested, the planet Selenon is located in the Daastan sector, within the Outer Rim territories. Nonetheless, he did manage to halt the advance of the New Republic at that time, inflicting significant losses on the New Republic fleet. But he also suffered enormous losses, including the destruction of his flagship, one of the most valuable ships of the remnants of the Imperial fleet. Gilad only somewhat learned to fight by the time of the Vong invasion. But at what cost this learning came to the Imperial remnants? It is not surprising that many Grand Moffs and admirals within the Imperial remnant disliked Gilad. And it is not surprising that a conspiracy was brewing against him. This rebellion nearly resulted in Gilad being ousted and the rise to power of more active Imperial officers and politicians who were in favor of continuing the fight against the New Republic. In the novels Spectre of the Past and Vision of the Future by Timothy Zahn, part of the internal conflicts within the New Republic and the Imperial remnant is shown, along with this rebellion. Lusankya was not the only superstar destroyer captured by the New Republic. There was another one. This ship bore the name Guardian. Before Guardian was in the possession of the New Republic, it was owned by one of the leaders of the Imperial remnants, Gayan Drommel. For most of the Galactic Civil War, neither he nor his ship participated in battles. After Endor, the flagship sustained serious damage and was forced to flee. In a rare occurrence, Guardian had both of its hyperdrives damaged. Guardian never reached its intended destination. It emerged from hyperspace in a distant part of the galaxy, near the planet Solex. This is in the Fardon system, located in wild space. Meanwhile, the galaxy was embroiled in active fighting on all fronts, which meant that there was nowhere to get help for the would-be dictator. In fact, the ship was long considered lost. Drommel deployed all 3 prefabricated bases on the surface of the planet Solex, forming a makeshift city. Thus, the Imperials lived there for over 10 years. They lived away from the war, in peace and quiet. All this time, Drommel never gave up hope of repairing the hyperdrives. Otherwise, the Guardian was combat-ready. Only in the year 7 ABY did the shuttles and search teams dispatched for supplies begin bringing back parts for hull and hyperdrive repairs. But once the ship was brought back to operational status, it was discovered by agents of the New Republic. What followed was the betrayal of one of Drommel's aides, and the ceremonial handing over of the ship to the former enemies. This event took place in the year 16 ABY, which is 12 years after the Battle of Endor. The Guardian and its crew missed the most active period of the Galactic Civil War. They were fortunate, particularly in avoiding involvement in the grand battles orchestrated first by Thrawn, and later by the resurrected Palpatine. Unlike the Lusankya, which during the war against the Yuuzhan Vong was used by Wedge Antilles to ram a Yuuzhan Vong worldship, the Guardian proved to be a survivor. As the flagship of the New Republic's Third Fleet, the ship managed to participate in several battles of the latter stages of the Galactic Civil War, notably in the battles of Champala and Anx Minor. Incidentally, at Anx Minor, the incompetence of Gilad Pelayon was once again confirmed, as he lost 8 star destroyers in that engagement. Conversely, the genius of Admiral Ackbar was reaffirmed. Admiral Ackbar commanded from the former Imperial superdreadnought. Ackbar demonstrated superior intellect, courage, and resourcefulness. Unlike Gilad Pelayon, Ackbar did not study in military academies and did not have a traditional military education. After the peace agreement between the New Republic and the Imperial remnant, the Guardian continued to serve its new owners for many years. It fought successfully in the war against the Yuuzhan Vong, persisting from the first to the last day of the conflict. The Guardian remained in service even after the war, when the New Republic was transformed into the Galactic Alliance. By that time, all other Executor-class super battleships had long been lost in battles or destroyed by saboteurs. Nonetheless, the Lusankya also served for a considerable time, with the New Republic fleet utilizing it for around 20 years.